r/MaliciousCompliance. Boss demanded I work unpaid overtime with proof. Hashtag chunk 1, the email that changed everything. I read the email 4 times, each time hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something that made legal sense. They didn't. All store managers must ensure closing procedures are completed unpaid after store hours until 9 p.m. This is non-negotiable. Document compliance weekly and report to me. Failure to implement will result in immediate termination. It was from Derek Chin, my district manager, sent to all 12 store managers in our region at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. The timestamp seemed intentional, like he knew nobody would call him out on something that ridiculous at that hour. I was sitting in my cramped apartment above a Vietnamese restaurant, still in my store polo shirt because I'd driven straight home after my shift. It was my 3rd consecutive day working until 9:30 p.m. without clocking out, and my feet were killing me. More importantly, my conscience was screaming. This wasn't my first rodeo with Derek, but it was definitely the most brazen move he'd pulled yet. Let me back up. I'm 24, I've been a retail manager for 3 years, and I've always told myself I was one of the good ones, the managers who actually gave a shit about hourly employees. I fought for wage increases, defended my team from corporate's ridiculous demands, and tried to create an environment where people actually wanted to come to work. At Electro Hub, a mid-tier electronics retailer that had been bleeding market share for 2 years, that meant something. It meant loyalty in a workforce that had every reason to be cynical. Derek had taken over the district manager position 6 months ago. He came from some high-performance region that was apparently thriving under aggressive cost-cutting measures. Within the first month, he'd started making suggestions, then demands, about optimizing labor. First, it was cutting payroll hours. Then it was expecting managers to absorb closing duties without paying ourselves overtime. Then it escalated to the really insane stuff. 3 weeks ago, he'd called me into his office during a surprise visit. I remember the air conditioning was blasting in there while the sales floor was stifling. He told me, very casually, that my store's closing efficiency ratings were unacceptable and that I needed to stay after close to train my team on proper procedures. Unpaid. He'd said it like it was obvious, like this was how retail worked everywhere. If you can't dedicate yourself to excellence without needing extra compensation, he'd said, actually using those words, then maybe you're not cut out for management. I was making $42,000 a year to manage a store with $3.2 million in annual revenue, oversee 16 employees, handle inventory, deal with customer service disasters, and do the scheduling. The overtime alone at that point was worth thousands annually. But I needed this job. Jobs like this don't grow on trees, especially not in a market where retail was visibly dying. So I'd complied. I'd stayed after close and trained my team, off the clock. I documented it in my personal notes, which probably sounds paranoid, but I had this weird feeling in my gut telling me to keep records. Then the text started. Derek would text me at random hours, need you to audit inventory tonight after close, or complete full floor reset without clocking anyone out for the time, train them on the job, or my personal favorite, all managers should be willing to work for free to prove their commitment to the company. I'd screenshot those, too. Something inside me had been quietly preparing for this moment, even though I couldn't have articulated exactly what this was. What I hadn't expected was the email blast. That was stupidly reckless. That was the kind of corporate malfeasance that leaves a trail you can actually follow. My manager's mindset kicked in. I opened a new email folder on my work account and labeled it Documentation. I forwarded the email there. Then I pulled up my screenshots and started organizing them by date. I had maybe 45 screenshots over the past 3 weeks, texts from Derek, messages in a company group chat, even a few photos I'd taken of handwritten notes he'd left in my manager's binder during his last store visit. What was interesting, what was actually damning, was that this wasn't just happening at my store. I'd been talking to the other managers in our district. Off the record, of course, but word travels. At least 6 other stores had the same demands. Derek had called a manager conference 2 weeks ago and explicitly told us that hourly employees should be encouraged to stay for unpaid training time as a benefit to their career development. That was wage theft. That was illegal. I sat there in my apartment, my toes curling in my socks, my pizza getting cold on the coffee table, and I did something I probably should have done weeks earlier. I Googled wage and hour violations and unpaid overtime. I found the Department of Labor website. I read through the Federal Fair Labor Standards Act. It was very, very clear. Employers must pay all employees for all hours worked. No exceptions for training. No exceptions for career development. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I could report this. I had evidence. I had multiple witnesses who'd been affected. I had Derek's own words, preserved in writing, admitting to the practice. The rational part of my brain immediately jumped to the consequences, my job, obviously. My professional reputation in a relatively small retail market. The possibility of being blacklisted from other retail management positions if Derek decided to retaliate. The tight job market didn't afford someone like me many safety nets. But the other part of my brain, the part that had seen my team members stressed about making rent, the part that had watched good employees leave because they couldn't afford to stay, that part was already composing the first email. I saved my work, took a screenshot of the current timestamp on my phone, and started a new document on my personal laptop. This was too important for work devices. Whatever was about to happen next, I wasn't going to let them control the narrative through access to my email. Derek had just handed me a loaded gun and pointed it at himself. Now I had to decide whether to pull the trigger. Hashtag chunk 2, the confrontation. I didn't sleep that night. Around 2 a.m., I gave up pretending and made coffee instead. I sat at my kitchen table with my personal laptop open, my phone face down beside it, and I read through every single piece of documentation I'd collected. The pile of evidence was actually worse than I'd initially realized, not worse in the sense of being incomplete, but worse in the sense of being undeniably systematic. There was a pattern. Derek's texts weren't casual suggestions. They were tactical, deliberate, and designed to create a paper trail that looked innocent on first glance but painted a crystal clear picture under scrutiny. Need closing procedures optimized could sound like legitimate management speak until you paired it with, without additional labor costs, or staff should consider this professional development. The email from last night was his mistake. That email was the thread that, if pulled, would unravel the entire thing. I created a spreadsheet. Dates, times, requested tasks, approximate hours. When I extrapolated based on what I knew about the other stores in the district, we were looking at hundreds of unpaid hours across the region. Thousands of dollars in stolen wages. 6 managers, 16 to 20 hourly employees per store, minimum 3 to 5 unpaid hours per week per location. My hands were shaking. Not with fear, exactly, but with something like righteous anger mixed with genuine dread. The thing about being 24 and relatively new to management is that you still remember what it was like to be hourly. I'd been that person living paycheck to paycheck, choosing between gas money and groceries, working multiple jobs and still falling short. I'd clawed my way into a salaried position through a combination of hard work and luck, but I hadn't forgotten what it felt like to be exploited. To know that your employer was stealing time from you and that you were too vulnerable to push back. My team at ElectroHub was mostly college students and people who'd hit rough patches financially. Maya, one of my best cashiers, was putting herself through community college while working full-time. Carlos was supporting his mom after his dad had a stroke. Jordan was saving to move out of an abusive home situation. These weren't abstract concepts to me. I saw them every shift. I knew their struggles. I knew Derek was taking food out of their mouths. By 6 a.m., I made a decision. Before I reported anything to the government, I was going to document one more time that Derek knew exactly what he was doing and that I had explicitly refused to continue. I opened my work email and drafted a message. I read it 12 times, revising for tone, trying to sound professional and not accusatory, knowing full well that the tone didn't matter, only the fact that I was creating a written record of my refusal would matter. Derek, I received your email regarding unpaid closing procedures. I need to respectfully decline to implement this policy. According to the Fair Labor Standards Act, all employees must be compensated for all hours worked. Unpaid work after store closure violates federal wage and hour law. I cannot direct my team to work unpaid, nor can I work unpaid myself. If you'd like to discuss extending closing procedures, we can explore options within legal compliance, including adjusting the posted closing time or allocating labor hours to compensate for the additional work. Please let me know how you'd like to proceed. Best, my name. I read it again. It was professional. It was clear. It was a bullet point in my timeline, proof that I'd explicitly flagged the illegality and refused participation. I hit send at 6:47 a.m. Then I waited. The response came at 9:15 a.m. while I was doing opening inventory at the store. I saw the notification pop up on my work phone and my stomach dropped. This attitude is exactly what I'm talking about. You're not a team player. This is an issue with your commitment to the company. I need you to understand that retail management requires sacrifice. My store managers all understand this. Clearly, you're struggling with the expectations of your position. We need to have a conversation about your future here. I'll be visiting your store on Friday at 2 p.m. Be prepared to discuss your willingness to meet district standards. It wasn't explicitly a threat of termination. But it was close enough. The subtext was clear: comply or get fired. And then, about 40 minutes later, another email came through, this time to the entire district manager team and copied to the regional VP. It was Derek's response to what must have been a corporate query about store performance. But buried in the third paragraph was this gem. Store managers who are unwilling to commit to optimized labor solutions should be replaced with candidates who understand the competitive retail landscape and are willing to make the hard decisions necessary for profitability. I read that email 3 times. Then I forwarded it to my personal email account along with every other piece of documentation. The dread was real now, mixing with adrenaline. Derek was escalating. He was doing it in writing. He was creating a retaliation narrative. I'd refused his demand, and now he was positioning me as uncommitted and replaceable. If he fired me, he'd frame it as performance-related, not retaliation. Except I had his emails. I had his texts. I had documented evidence that this was specifically retaliation for refusing to participate in illegal wage theft. I called my mom during my lunch break, which was stupid because she was at work and couldn't really talk, but I needed to hear a human voice. Mom, hypothetically, if you reported your boss for illegal labor practices, what would you do? Hypothetically. She laughed nervously. I'd call a lawyer. Why? What's happening? Nothing yet. Just thinking through a situation. Well, thinking through it with a lawyer is smarter than thinking through it alone. Honey, if something's actually happening, don't try to handle it yourself. I didn't argue with her, but I also didn't commit to anything. The truth was, I was terrified of a lawyer. Lawyers cost money. Lawyers meant formal proceedings. Lawyers meant that bridge was burned with Derek, with the company, potentially with the entire district. But Derek was already burning the bridge. He was just being subtle about it. Friday was 2 days away. I had 48 hours to decide whether to blow the whistle before Derek decided to fire me, or if I reported him first, whether that was preemptive self-defense or something that would backfire spectacularly. I went back to the sales floor and helped a customer choose between 2 laptops, and I thought about how unfair it was that the decision I was about to make, a decision that should have been straightforward, had this many terrifying consequences attached to it. He'd handed me a loaded gun. But when I pulled the trigger, the recoil was going to hit me, too. The question was whether I was prepared to take the hit. Hashtag chunk 3, the setup. Thursday morning, I woke up to 17 text messages in our store manager group chat. Derek had organized a district-wide meeting for Friday evening, after his planned visit to my store. The message was casual enough on the surface: mandatory attendance. We'll be discussing Q3 projections and operational excellence. But the timing felt deliberate. He was going to visit me, presumably fire me or force my resignation, and then address the other managers with a narrative already in place. I was the problem. I was the one who didn't understand the industry. I was the one who'd be gone. I sat on the edge of my bed, phone in hand, and felt something shift inside my chest. Not quite panic, but the precursor to it, that electric, sick feeling of knowing you're about to make an irreversible decision. The thing about gathering evidence is that it's only useful if you actually do something with it. Sitting on it, keeping it private, pretending you don't have it, that's not protection. That's just slow motion surrender. I called the number I'd written down 3 weeks ago, the one I'd found on the Department of Labor website at 11 p.m. on a night I couldn't sleep. The woman who answered had a kind voice and asked me to describe the situation. I did, carefully, aware that I was crossing a threshold I couldn't uncross. She listened, asked clarifying questions, and then said something that made my hands shake again. You've got solid documentation. That helps. But I want to be clear, once you file a formal complaint, your employer will know it's you. This company has 6 locations. 7, I corrected. Though he only directly supervises 5. And how many employees are affected? I gave her the numbers I'd calculated. The silence on the other end felt significant. That's a pattern, she said finally. That's not an accident. Do you have representation? Not yet. I'd recommend getting a lawyer before you file. Protect yourself. I thanked her, hung up, and immediately felt regret crash into me. I'd just made a phone call that Derek couldn't undo. I'd flagged myself to a government agency. There was a record now. There was an official acknowledgement that something illegal was happening. I called a labor attorney 3 minutes later, the first one that came up in my search results because I was too much of a coward to actually research properly. I just needed to move, to do something, to take action before my brain caught up and convinced me this was a mistake. The attorney was named Susan Chen, and she had an opening at 4 p.m. that same day. 4 hours away. I texted my assistant manager, family emergency. Need to leave at 3. You've got closing. He responded immediately, yeah, no problem. Everything okay? I didn't answer. Everything was decidedly not okay. I spent the next 3 hours trying to work normally, which was its own special kind of torture. I helped customers. I approved returns. I coached a new employee on the register. I acted like my entire professional life wasn't about to potentially explode. The store was slow, Thursday afternoons always were, so I organized a stockroom that didn't need organizing and reset a display that was already reset. Busy work to keep my hands moving. At 2:47 p.m., I clocked out and drove to Susan Chen's office, which turned out to be in a small professional building downtown, the kind of place that had a lot of plants in the waiting room and soft carpet that muffled sound. There was something deeply civilized about it, which made me feel both reassured and even more terrified. This was real now. Official. Susan was in her 50s, with reading glasses on a chain and a no-nonsense manner that was somehow comforting. She didn't minimize anything or make me feel dramatic for being here. Instead, she read through my documentation, which I'd printed and brought in a folder, like some kind of paranoid middle manager, and she nodded periodically. How long have you worked there? She asked. 2 years at this location. The wage theft started about 6 months ago. And you've been refusing for how long? Since I realized what was happening. About 3 weeks. She looked at me over her glasses. You're young to be managing a retail operation. I got promoted fast. Clearly. She set down the papers. Here's my assessment, you've got strong documentation of a pattern. The emails are particularly useful because they show knowledge and intent. The retaliation emails are even better because they're explicit. He's tying his negative statements about you directly to your refusal to participate in illegal activity. That's actually textbook retaliation. So, I should report him. I think you should prepare for the likelihood that you'll need to. But I want to be strategic about this. She opened a document on her computer. He's visiting your store tomorrow at 2 p.m. Yes. Is he planning to fire you? I think so, but I don't know for certain. He said we need to discuss my future here, which is corporate speak for. I know what it is, she said mildly. Here's what I want you to do. Document that conversation. If he brings up termination, if he brings up your refusal to work unpaid, if he threatens your job in any way, document it. Write it down immediately afterward with times and dates. Can you do that? I think so. Don't think. You need to be certain. If he fires you or you resign under duress tomorrow, I want every detail of that conversation documented within 30 minutes of it ending. Okay. I nodded. And don't do anything precipitous before that meeting. Don't send emails. Don't call corporate. Don't talk to other managers. You let tomorrow happen, you document it, and then we decide what your next move is. Clear. Clear. She printed something out, a retainer agreement, and explained what her hourly rate was. I felt my stomach drop at the number, but she must have seen something in my face because she added, this company is stealing wages from dozens of employees. Once we file a complaint and they settle or it goes through litigation, there are mechanisms to recover attorney's fees from the employer. You're not going to be paying for this alone indefinitely. It should have been reassuring. Somehow, it wasn't. It just meant this was really happening. This was actually real in a way that phone calls and documentation spreadsheets hadn't quite made it feel. I drove back to work in a daze, clocked back in, and finished my shift. My assistant manager asked if everything was okay with my family, and I lied and said yes, it was fine, just a false alarm. I went home and didn't sleep. Again. Friday morning, I put on my best black pants and a company polo, the uniform of retail professionalism, and I drove to work knowing that by this time tomorrow, everything would be different. Derek would arrive at 2 p.m. I had 12 hours to decide whether I was actually ready to burn this whole thing down. #Chunk4, the waiting. Friday morning felt like the longest day of my life, and it hadn't even really started yet. I arrived at the store at 7 a.m., an hour earlier than usual, because sitting at home staring at the ceiling was worse than any kind of work. The building was empty except for the overnight crew finishing their shift, 2 high school kids who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. I didn't blame them. I grabbed a coffee from the break room and stood in the stockroom, nursing it and trying to remember how to breathe normally. The plan was simple, work the morning shift, document everything when Derek arrived, and then figure out what happened next. In theory. In practice, I felt like I was vibrating at a frequency only dogs could hear. By 9 a.m., the morning shift crew was arriving. My assistant manager, Jason, came in looking concerned. He was a good kid, 23, trying to make assistant manager himself, and he'd been asking questions lately about why I kept refusing Derek's after-hours demands. I dodged the topic, but I could tell he was starting to wonder if I was the problem, or if something else was going on. The optics of that worried me more than I wanted to admit. "You sure you're good?" he asked, setting his stuff in the locker room. "You've been weird all week." "Just tired," I said, which was technically true. "Long week. Derek's coming today, right?" "I heard something about that." "Yeah. Afternoon visit." "Cool. Maybe he'll check out that POS system issue we've been having." Jason moved toward the floor, then paused. "Hey, is there something I should know? Like, is everything okay with you and him?" That question landed harder than it should have. I realized, with a sick twist in my stomach, that I hadn't considered how my actions might affect Jason and the other employees I managed. Derek would spin this somehow. He always did. He would make me the bad guy, and people like Jason would believe it because they didn't have access to the full picture. "Everything's fine," I said, which felt like the biggest lie I'd told all week. "Just normal district stuff." He seemed to accept that, but I could tell he didn't quite believe me. The morning was mercifully busy. We had a customer influx around 10 a.m., some kind of promotion had run in the local paper and people actually came in looking for deals. I threw myself into helping them, into the mechanics of scanning items and processing transactions, into the blessed simplicity of work that didn't require me to think about my future. Around 11:30 a.m., my phone buzzed. A text from Derek, "Still on for 2. Need to discuss some things." I stared at those words for longer than necessary. Some things. That could mean anything. My paranoid brain had constructed an entire scenario where he'd somehow discovered that I'd contacted the Department of Labor. But that wasn't possible. Susan had been careful. The DOL doesn't alert employers to complaints before they investigate them. I was being irrational. Or was I? I typed back, "Yes, 2 p.m. I'll be here." He didn't respond, which was worse than any response would have been. By 1 p.m., I was in the back room of the store, hands shaking slightly as I reviewed Susan's instructions in my head. Document. Times and dates. Don't be defensive. Don't volunteer information. I'd written notes on my phone, actual timestamps of what would happen and when, which probably wasn't helpful if I was supposed to be playing it cool, but I needed the security blanket. Jason kept glancing at me from the sales floor. I could see him through the stockroom window, watching to see if anything weird was about to happen. The other employees were working normally, unaware that their district manager was about to show up and have a conversation with me that might change everything. At 1:58 p.m., Derek's car pulled into the parking lot. I watched from the stockroom window as he got out, tall, professional, wearing a suit even though it was Friday and most managers dressed casual. He looked exactly the same as he always did, which was somehow the worst part. There was no indication in his body language that he was about to try to fire me, but there was also no indication that he wasn't. He walked into the store, made a small wave to Jason, and headed straight for the back office. I was waiting for him at my desk, sitting down because standing felt like it would make me look nervous, but then sitting felt too casual, so I stood up right before he opened the door. The whole thing took maybe 3 seconds and I'd already fucked up the optics. "Hey," he said, closing the door behind him. "How's the week been?" "Fine," I said. "Busy Friday already." He nodded, taking a seat in a chair across from my desk without being invited. That was a power move, and we both knew it. He was settling in for a conversation, not a quick check-in. "So, I've been thinking about your situation," he said. His tone was conversational, almost friendly, which made my skin crawl. And I realize I may have come on too strong with some of my requests. That's on me. I blinked. That was not the opening I'd expected. "I appreciate you letting me know that this schedule wasn't working for you," he continued, folding his hands on his lap. "And I want to make sure we're on the same page moving forward. This district is really important to me, and I need to know that my managers are fully committed to the mission." He wasn't firing me. Or if he was doing it very obliquely. "I'm committed," I said carefully. "Are you?" He tilted his head slightly. "Because it seems like maybe you're thinking about looking for other opportunities." I picked up on some vibes. My blood ran cold. Vibes. What vibes? Had he been talking to someone? Had word gotten back to him somehow? "I'm not looking for other opportunities," I said, which was technically true. I was currently in the process of potentially destroying my career, not finding a new one. "That's good to hear. Because I'd hate to lose you. You're a good manager, you know that. You care about the details. You care about the people. That's valuable." He smiled, and it didn't reach his eyes. "But I also need managers who understand that there's a difference between thinking about what's possible and actually doing what needs to be done. Do you know what I mean?" This was a test. Every word of this was a test, and I was failing it by existing. "I'm not sure," I said, because honesty felt safer than pretending to understand his corporate speak. "I mean that sometimes, as leaders, we have to make tough calls. We have to ask people to go the extra mile. And if they won't..." He paused, letting the sentence hang. "Well, that tells us something about their loyalty. Their character." He wasn't threatening me. Not explicitly. But he was threatening me. "I understand," I said. "Do you?" He stood up, which meant the meeting was ending. "Because I'm going to be straight with you. There are managers in this district who understand what it takes to succeed. And there are managers who..." He gestured vaguely. "Struggle with the reality of retail. I'm hoping you're in the first category. But I need to see that commitment. Starting now." He walked to the door and paused with his hand on the handle. "The Q3 projections are tight. Really tight. We're going to need everyone putting in extra time. Off the clock, under the table, whatever it takes. I need to know I can count on you." And there it was. In writing in my memory, delivered in person with witnesses potentially within earshot. "I'll do what I can," I said, which was the most non-committal thing I could manage. He smiled again. "I'm sure you will." After he left, I sat at my desk for 30 minutes, hands shaking, documenting every single word he'd said. Hashtag chunk 5. I documented everything in my phone's notes app, timestamp to the minute, 2:17 p.m. Derek's visit. Key phrases, extra time. Off the clock, under the table, whatever it takes. I even added the date and the fact that Jason had witnessed him arrive, that multiple employees could corroborate he'd been here. It wasn't a recording, but it was something. It was evidence that he was continuing the same pattern even after I'd supposedly backed down. My hands were still shaking when Jason knocked on the office door 20 minutes later. He gone? Jason asked, peeking in. Yeah. Just store stuff. Q3 projections. Jason came in and closed the door behind him, which immediately put me on edge. Dude, I don't know what's happening between you two, but it's weird. He asked me like 3 questions about you when he was leaving. Wanted to know if I thought you were engaged with the team. My stomach dropped. What did you tell him? I said yeah, obviously. You're fine. But he seemed like he was fishing for something. Like he already had an answer and wanted to see if I'd contradict it. This was exactly what I'd been worried about. Derek was building a case. He was gathering evidence, but from the wrong angle, not evidence of what he'd done, but evidence that I was somehow the problem. Disengaged. Disloyal. Difficult. Thanks for the heads up, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Is everything okay? Jason asked, and I could hear genuine concern in his voice. Like, if there's something going on, I can maybe help. Or talk to someone. Or whatever. I appreciated it. I really did. But I couldn't tell him. Not yet. Not until I knew how this was actually going to play out. Everything's fine, I lied again. Just normal management stuff. He's always checking in on people's morale. It's probably nothing. Jason didn't look convinced, but he let it go. After he left, I sat in my office for another hour, ostensibly doing inventory reconciliation but actually just staring at spreadsheets without absorbing anything. The problem was that Derek's visit had raised a new concern. He was clearly suspicious. Suspicious people investigate. They ask questions. They talk to other people. And while he couldn't know specifically that I'd contacted the DOL, he could definitely sense that something had changed. That I was pulling away. I needed to talk to Susan again. But I also needed to be careful about it. If Derek was watching me, and now I was pretty sure he was, I couldn't afford to make it obvious that I was taking legal action. Every phone call, every email, could be scrutinized. At 5 p.m., I texted Susan from my personal phone, making sure to do it outside the store. Need advice. Boss visited today. Still making illegal demands but seems suspicious now. How concerned should I be? The response came back 15 minutes later. Don't change your behavior. Act normal. He might be testing you. The DOL will reach out to your employer within 2 to 4 weeks for investigation. Once they do, he'll know something's up. Until then, document and maintain status quo. Maintain status quo. Right. Except the status quo was illegal, and Derek was now explicitly asking me to participate in it again, and if I refused, I was the bad guy. If I complied, I was enabling wage theft and potentially implicating myself further. The more I thought about it, the more the whole situation felt like a trap. A carefully constructed trap where there was no right answer, only degrees of wrong. I got home around 7 p.m. and immediately fell into the spiral of reading Reddit threads about labor law, wrongful termination, and retaliation. Every thread had a similar theme. Companies always retaliate, legally or otherwise. They make your life difficult. They document fake performance issues. They create a hostile work environment and somehow make it seem like it's your fault. And the comments were always the same. Document everything. Get everything in writing. Consult with a labor attorney before you do anything. I'd done that. I had Susan. But Susan was a stranger on the phone, and Derek was a person who controlled my schedule, my paycheck, and my professional reputation. At 10 p.m., I got a text from an unknown number. This is Susan. Got a new number for privacy. How are you holding up? I hadn't realized she'd be able to text me outside of official channels, but I was grateful for it. Okay, I think. He's suspicious but doesn't know for sure. I'm scared he's going to try to build a case against me before the DOL contacts him. Possible. But retaliation is illegal. Document any negative changes to your employment conditions, any write-ups, any schedule changes. If he fires you, that's literally the strongest case we could have. I stared at that message for a long time. The strongest case we could have. Which meant the best outcome for me legally might be the worst outcome for me practically. Getting fired would be evidence, but it would also mean I didn't have a job. I texted back, what if I just resign? Walk away. Start over somewhere else. The response took longer to come back. That's your choice. But you'd be giving up leverage. And frankly, once you're gone, it's harder to prove this was systemic. Other employees are still there, still being exploited. Leverage. Other employees. The word kept coming back to that, Jason, and Marcus from the evening shift, and 2 part-time associates who probably needed their paychecks more than any of us. If I quit, who was going to document what Derek was doing to them? I didn't sleep well that night. I kept waking up and checking my phone, convinced I'd missed a message from Derek or that the DOL had somehow already called, or that my computer had been hacked and everyone at corporate knew what I'd done. By Saturday morning, the anxiety had crystallized into something different. Something almost like determination. I couldn't control what Derek did or what the DOL did or what my future was going to look like. But I could control whether I gave in. Whether I normalized the illegal behavior. Whether I let him win by making me complicit. So I went to work and I was professional and calm and engaged. I helped Jason with the POS system issue. I reviewed inventory with Marcus. I was the manager Derek had described, committed, detail-oriented, caring about the people. And when Derek texted me that evening with a casual, hey, can you handle the closing crew's overtime scheduling? We need extra bodies next weekend. I responded with a simple, clean email to the corporate HR department, CCing Susan's address, documenting the request and asking for clarification on whether this overtime would be paid or unpaid. It was a small thing. But it was in writing. And it was the beginning of showing that I wasn't going to quietly comply anymore. #chunk6. The response came faster than I expected. Monday morning, 8:47 a.m., I was in the office doing the weekly schedule when my work email pinged. Not from Derek. From corporate. From someone named Patricia Chen, Senior Director of Human Resources. We received your inquiry regarding overtime scheduling practices. Please schedule a call with me this week at your earliest convenience. Time-sensitive matter. My stomach lurched. Time-sensitive. That could mean a lot of things. Good things. Bad things. Things that would make everything move faster than I was mentally prepared for. I called Susan immediately, stepping outside and walking toward the parking lot where no one could overhear. They want to talk to me, I said, not bothering with a greeting. Corporate HR. They said, time-sensitive. That's good, Susan said, and I could hear the careful professionalism in her voice, but underneath it, something that might have been excitement. That means they're taking it seriously. This is likely a preliminary inquiry before the Doel investigation goes public. What do I say to them? The truth. Everything. Don't minimize anything or try to make Derek look better than he is. Don't worry about loyalty to him or the company. They're calling you because they already suspect something is wrong. Your job is to confirm what they suspect and provide details. After I hung up, I stood in the parking lot for another 5 minutes, just breathing. The machinery was in motion now. This wasn't theoretical anymore. This wasn't just documentation and anxiety and late-night Reddit spirals. This was real. I emailed Patricia back, available Tuesday or Wednesday afternoon. Thank you for reaching out. She replied within minutes, Tuesday 2 p.m. Conference line, number. This call will be recorded for quality assurance. Please ensure privacy. Recorded. Okay. That actually made me feel better somehow. There would be an official record. Something I couldn't be accused of misrepresenting later. The problem was Derek. The problem was always Derek. I didn't know if he'd been contacted yet. I didn't know if he knew about Patricia's email. I didn't know if he was suspicious, or if he was already making moves to protect himself, or if he was completely oblivious and my malicious compliance email had just registered as a normal HR inquiry about scheduling. Tuesday came creeping up like a deadline I couldn't escape. I went through work like I was moving through water, everything felt slow and pressurized and wrong. Jason noticed I was distracted. Marcus asked if I was feeling okay. I kept checking the clock. At 1:45 p.m., I locked myself in the office with my phone and the conference line number Patricia had sent. The store was busy, it was a Tuesday afternoon in November, which meant holiday shopping was starting to pick up. Derek was on the floor. No one was watching me. I dialed the number exactly at 2 p.m. Patricia answered immediately. Professional, brisk, exactly what I expected from someone with Senior Director in their title. She confirmed my identity, asked me to verify that I understood the call was being recorded, and then she got straight to it. I've received documentation suggesting that there may be overtime scheduling practices at your location that don't comply with federal wage and hour law. Before we escalate this to an official investigation, I want to hear directly from you. Are you aware of any off-the-clock work being required or encouraged at your store? I thought about Derek's smile. The way he'd said, whatever it takes. The months of emails and texts sitting in my phone, dated and documented. I told her everything. I talked for 45 minutes. I went through the timeline. I described specific instances. I named names, Derek, obviously, but also the employees who'd been affected, though I tried to be careful to note that they might not want to be identified as whistleblowers. I mentioned the emails. The texts. The way Derek had explicitly said he wanted it to be, off the clock, under the table. Patricia asked detailed questions. How often? How many employees? What was the total estimated amount of unpaid wages? Did I have documentation? Had I reported this to anyone else? Had Derek ever explicitly told me not to report it? By the time I answered the last question, I realized I'd been shaking for the entire call. Thank you for your honesty, Patricia said, and something in her tone made me think this might be worse than Derek realized. I'm going to be direct with you, what you've described is a serious violation. We're going to open an official investigation immediately. That means we'll likely be contacting your location this week or next to begin interviews with other employees and to request documentation of scheduling records, timesheets, and communication. Okay, I said quietly. I also want to make sure you're aware of your protections under the Fair Labor Standards Act. Any adverse employment action taken against you because of this report would constitute illegal retaliation. If you experience any schedule changes, disciplinary action, or hostile treatment following this conversation, I want you to document it and report it immediately. Do you understand? I understand. One more thing, Patricia said, and I could hear her adjusting something on her end, her voice becoming slightly less formal. What you did took courage. Most people wouldn't. Most people would just accept that it's how things work. I want you to know that before things get uncomfortable, and they probably will, before this becomes a whole thing that affects your workplace and your job and your professional life. I see reports like this, and most of them come from people who decided it's not worth the risk to speak up. But people like you. People who do it anyway. That's how we actually stop these violations from happening again. After we hung up, I sat in the office for a long time without moving. The machinery had moved. Derek didn't know it yet, but his time was running out. Corporate was coming. The Doel was coming. Whatever happened next was no longer in my control or Derek's control, it was in the hands of people whose entire job was to figure out exactly what he'd done and make sure he paid for it. Which should have felt good. Which should have felt like relief. But all I felt was dread. Because I still had to go back out on that floor. I still had to look Derek in the eye when he inevitably found out. I still had to come back to this store and face whatever consequences came next, even if those consequences were technically illegal. I took a deep breath and opened the office door. Derek was at the register, helping a customer with a laptop return. He looked up as I walked past, gave me a quick nod, and smiled. He had no idea. In the next week or two, that smile was going to disappear. Chunk 7. The waiting was worse than anything that had come before. I'd expected the investigation to move quickly. Patricia had made it sound imminent, inevitable, like a storm system that was already visible on the radar and heading straight for us. But days passed with nothing. Wednesday. Thursday. Friday. Derek went about his business like nothing had changed. He still barked at employees about numbers. He still made his little comments about commitment and going the extra mile. He still scheduled people for shifts that ended at 9 p.m. and then asked them to stay until 10:30 to finish inventory, off the clock, just help me out here. The knowledge that I'd already reported him, that corporate investigators were probably already preparing their approach, made watching him do it feel like being trapped in an elevator with a bomb that no one else could see. I started documenting everything obsessively. Every conversation. Every off-the-clock request. Every text that came through. I created a separate folder on my phone labeled evidence and added to it daily, sometimes multiple times a day. It became a kind of compulsion, the one thing I could control when everything else felt chaotic and accelerating towards something I couldn't predict. Susan had warned me, they'll likely contact the store directly before they contact Derek individually. They'll ask for records, interview employees, build their case before he even knows he's the target. You need to be prepared for that domino effect. What I wasn't prepared for was how much it would hurt to watch my coworkers realize what was happening. It started on a Thursday afternoon in the second week after my call with Patricia. A woman came in asking for Derek. She had a corporate badge, the kind that meant someone from outside our district. She was young, professional, armed with a leather folder and a very official demeanor. She asked to speak privately with Derek and then with me. The whole store knew something was happening within about 15 minutes. Jason pulled me aside near the stockroom. "What's going on?" he asked. His face had gone pale. "Are we getting shut down? Is the company closing?" "I don't know," I lied, because I couldn't tell him without explaining why, and I couldn't explain without implicating myself in ways that might make things worse. Corporate sometimes does random audits. But he didn't believe me, and I could see the fear in his eyes, the fear that made sense for someone who depended on this job, who lived paycheck to paycheck, who couldn't afford for this store or his employment to become unstable. That guilt sat heavy in my chest for the rest of the day. By Friday, the second investigator had arrived. This one was older, a man with gray at his temples and a kind of tired professionalism that suggested he'd done this exact thing 100 times before. He was there to interview employees. He set up in the break room and called people in one by one, taking statements about scheduling practices, unpaid work, anything they'd experienced or witnessed. Marcus was called in first. Then Jenny. Then Tyler, who worked evening shifts and had logged probably more off-the-clock hours than anyone else on staff. I watched them go in and come out, their expressions shifting from confusion to something darker. Understanding. Anger. Derek was barely holding it together. He kept disappearing into the office, his voice raised enough that I could hear the edges of it through the door, talking to someone on the phone, probably his own lawyer or his own contacts at corporate. His jaw was tight. His movements were jerky and aggressive in a way they usually weren't. He knew something was happening. He just didn't know exactly what yet. The investigators left Friday evening without speaking to Derek directly. I learned later, from a group text Marcus sent to several of us, that they'd said they'd be reconvening with management in the following week. That was their language, reconvening. As if they hadn't already found exactly what they were looking for. Over the weekend, the store's group chat exploded. People were asking questions. Jenny had apparently told someone that the investigators asked about unpaid overtime practices, and that phrase had rippled through the staff like electricity. By Sunday night, everyone knew. Not the details, maybe, but the shape of it. Someone had reported something, and corporate was investigating labor violations. The irony was that Derek was probably furious at whoever he thought had done it. And if he knew it was me, he hadn't confronted me about it yet. Maybe he was waiting for his lawyer to advise him. Maybe he was still figuring out who to blame. The second week of November arrived with a kind of oppressive heaviness. Derek called a mandatory staff meeting for Monday morning before we opened. Everyone showed up, and I could see the anxiety on their faces, the same anxiety I'd been living with since I decided to report him. "There's been an HR audit," Derek announced. He looked like he'd aged 5 years in 1 week. The smile was gone. The false friendliness was gone. What was left was a man who understood, finally, that his actions had consequences. Some questions have come up about scheduling practices. I want to be clear, we are committed to full compliance with all federal wage and hour laws. Moving forward, anyone who works overtime will be paid for overtime. Any off-the-clock work is prohibited and will not be tolerated. He said it like he was reading from a script his lawyer had provided. Which he probably was. The employees looked at each other. Some of them looked at me, not accusingly, not yet, but with a kind of question in their eyes. Someone in this room had done this. Someone had made a choice to report what was happening. I kept my expression neutral. After the meeting, Derek called me into the office. My heart was hammering so hard I thought he must be able to hear it. "Do you know anything about this audit?" he asked. His voice was controlled, but I could see the vein in his temple pulsing. "Just what you said in the meeting," I replied carefully. "Corporate is investigating something." He studied my face for a long moment. "If you reported me." "I reported labor violations to the appropriate authorities," I said, and the words came out steadier than I felt. "If that's something you're concerned about, I'd suggest you talk to your lawyer." His face flushed red. For a second, I thought he was going to yell at me, or fire me on the spot, technically illegal for retaliation, but he clearly wasn't thinking about legal technicalities anymore. Instead, he just turned away. "You can go. Get back to the floor." I left the office with my heart still hammering and the cold realization that I just made it personal. He knew. Maybe he didn't have proof, but he knew. And now there was no going back. Chunk 8. The investigation stretched through November and into December. Corporate sent follow-up requests for records. There were more interviews. Derek's demeanor shifted from barely controlled anger to something more like panicked desperation. He started being almost aggressively compliant. No one worked a minute past their scheduled time. Everyone got their overtime properly documented and compensated. It was like watching someone try to sand down the edges of their crime after the fact, as if good behavior now could erase what had happened before. I heard through the grapevine that Derek had hired a lawyer. That corporate was considering termination. That there might be legal action against the company itself for systemic wage theft. The rumor mill at the store was running at full capacity, and I existed in the middle of it all, pretending I didn't know any more than anyone else. What I did know was that Marcus had started a group chat with about 6 of us, the people who'd worked the most off-the-clock hours, discussing the possibility of filing individual wage claims. Susan, my lawyer friend, had connected me with the actual attorney who was now representing several of my coworkers pro bono. The momentum was building towards something real, something concrete. The violations weren't abstract anymore. They had a number attached to them now, hundreds of thousands of dollars in unpaid wages across multiple stores in Derek's district. The week before Christmas, Derek didn't show up for his shift. No call. No explanation. Just an empty office when I arrived for my opening shift. His replacement, a district manager named Patricia Chen, different Patricia than the Doel one, obviously, came to the store with a kind of weary professionalism, the look of someone who'd been assigned to clean up a disaster. She called me into the office on my second day of her presence. "I know what you did," she said. Not accusingly. Just matter of fact. She was reviewing files on the desk, printed emails, documentation. Derek's under investigation for wage theft violations across 8 stores. Corporate is cooperating fully with the Department of Labor. There's going to be a settlement, probably significant. You've documented more evidence than anyone. I felt something tight in my chest loosen, just slightly. The company wants to make this right, Patricia continued. Which means we're looking at back pay for all affected employees, potentially punitive damages depending on what the DOL determines, and a complete overhaul of scheduling practices district-wide. Your contribution to that was substantial. What about Derek? I asked. Terminated for cause. He'll likely be facing legal consequences beyond that. The DOL doesn't take wage theft lightly, especially when it's this systematic and documented. She leaned back in her chair. And you should know, corporate is making some changes to how they handle retaliation. What happened with Derek putting more demands in writing when you refused? That's the exact kind of thing that makes a retaliation case easy to prove. He essentially documented his own illegal behavior and then doubled down when challenged. The irony was so perfect it almost made me laugh. There's something else, Patricia said. We'd like to offer you a position in our compliance division. It would be a promotion. Better pay, benefits, the whole thing. We need people who understand these issues, who aren't afraid to speak up about them. If you're interested. I wasn't sure I was. I'd spent the last 2 months in a kind of limbo, waiting to see if reporting someone I'd worked with, someone with power over my job and my paycheck, would destroy my career or set it right. The offer of a promotion was surreal. It felt like being rewarded for having the audacity to expect the law to be followed. But I also knew that Derek had trained me well, not in the way he intended, but thoroughly nonetheless. I'd learned how to document violations. I'd learned what courage looked like when it was terrified and did it anyway. I'd learned that systems could change if someone was willing to push. I need to think about it, I said. 2 weeks later, in early January, the Department of Labor issued their findings. Derek was personally liable for $287,000 in back wages and penalties. The company was liable for an additional $156,000 in violations across the district. 17 employees were eligible for settlements. Most importantly, Derek was banned from holding a management position at any company in our state for 5 years pending further investigation into whether criminal charges would be pursued. The news hit our store like a shockwave, even though everyone had been expecting it. There was a weird kind of celebration during the shift, not cruel, exactly, but cathartic. People who'd been anxious about their jobs, about their paychecks, about whether they'd done something wrong by working off the clock when they'd been ordered to, suddenly felt validated. Jason got a check for $3,400 in back wages. Marcus got nearly $8,000. Tyler, who'd worked the most off-the-clock hours, was getting a settlement that was going to help him finally move out of his parents' house. And me? I got $4,200 in back pay, plus the knowledge that I'd done the right thing even when it was terrifying. I sat in my apartment on a Friday night in mid-January with a check in my hand and Patricia Chen's job offer printed out on the kitchen table. The compliance division position. The promotion. The stability. It represented a choice: stay in retail with the validation that the system had worked, or step into something new, something that had come directly from my willingness to report what was wrong. I called Susan. "You're going to take it," she said, not as a question. "How do you know?" "Because you didn't call to ask permission. You called to tell me you'd decided, and you needed to tell someone who understood why it matters." She paused. "You walked into that store at 24 and discovered systematic exploitation. You reported it. You didn't back down when your job was threatened. That takes a specific kind of person, and companies know it. They want those people in positions where they can make systemic change." I looked at the check again. The numbers on it represented months of my labor that I'd almost been denied. It represented Derek's assumption that he could take what wasn't his because he had the authority to do so. It represented the moment I decided that fear wasn't bigger than what was right. The next morning, I called Patricia Chen and accepted the position. Derek's replacement at the store was a woman named Keisha who actually knew how to manage people without exploiting them. Within 3 months, that location's sales numbers went up. People showed up on time. They were engaged. Turns out that treating workers like human beings was good for business. The real victory, though, wasn't Derek's termination or my promotion or even the settlements. It was Marcus telling me that the wage he received had let him finally leave a situation he'd been trapped in. It was Jenny saying she felt like she could actually breathe again. It was the dozen other employees who'd worked off the clock, unpaid, because they'd been afraid to say no, and who suddenly understood that their fear had been the only thing keeping the system in place. I'd learned something crucial in all of this. Malicious compliance works best when you're complying with the law instead of the crime.